Over the course of my life, I've replaced 2 furnaces, rebuilt a transmission, put a new roof on a house, and once tore out an entire bathroom because a leaking pipe had ruined everything underneath it. I just never figured the next worn-out part that needed replacing would be my own knee. The surgeon's name was Dr. Harris. He was maybe 45, though doctors have reached an age where they all look young to me. He had that calm, steady voice people develop when they've performed the same operation hundreds of times. At your age, Frank, this is still a very standard procedure, he told me. I was 76. Standard procedure. That's an easy phrase to use when you're going home for dinner afterward and somebody else is the one being put to sleep under bright operating room lights. Still, I smiled and nodded. I've spent most of my 76 years nodding politely when people tell me things I don't particularly want to hear. If I had to list my talents, polite nodding would rank surprisingly high. My name is Frank Bennett. I spent almost 4 decades working as a civil engineer. Bridges, municipal buildings, drainage systems, you name it. My entire professional life revolved around understanding pressure. You calculate how much weight something can carry, study where the stress is concentrated, and reinforce the weak points before the whole thing fails. Funny thing is, I understood all of that about concrete and steel. It took me 76 years to understand it about family. I told my 3 children about the operation 7 weeks ahead of time. 7 weeks. Remember that. Not 7 hours. Not a last-minute phone call the night before. 7 full weeks. 49 days for one of my children to mark a date on a calendar, move an appointment, ask for a few hours off, arrange childcare, or drive to Knoxville, Tennessee, to sit beside their father before he went into surgery. 49 days. Let me tell you what they did with them. My oldest son, Daniel, was 51. He called one Thursday evening after I told him about the surgery. I could hear a basketball game playing on his television, and every few seconds there was a little silence that told me he was looking at something else on his phone. "Don't worry about anything, Dad," he said. "We'll figure it out. Somebody will be there." Then, almost seamlessly, he changed the subject. He wanted to know whether I'd had the house on Maple Ridge Road appraised recently. No particular reason, of course. He was just curious, just making conversation. My daughter Claire, who is 46, sent me a long voice message. I remember it was a little over 5 minutes because I listened to the whole thing twice. I kept waiting for the part where she would say, "I'll be there Tuesday," or "I've arranged to come the night before." That part never arrived. Instead, she explained how crazy everything had become. Her job was a disaster. Her husband, Mark, had something important happening at work. The children had activities. There were appointments, schedules, responsibilities. But she promised she'd work something out. "Obviously, Dad." She said obviously so many times that by the end of the message, the word had almost lost its meaning. Obviously she cared. Obviously she'd try. Obviously I understood. There was just nothing obvious about whether she was actually coming. Then there was my youngest, Emily. She was 33. Emily called about 3 weeks before the operation. I was standing at the kitchen counter making myself a turkey sandwich when her name appeared on my phone. Seeing it made me smile. That's one of the inconvenient things about loving your children. They can disappoint you 100 times, and their name lighting up your phone can still make something warm move through your chest. I answered. She asked how I felt about the surgery. Nervous, I admitted, but ready to get it over with. "That's good," she said. Then came the pause. I knew that pause. I've been hearing versions of it since she was in college. "Dad, I'm kind of in a bind. Her rent was short. Could I help?" I said yes. Of course I did. I had spent my entire life saying yes to my children. While we were still talking, I opened my banking app and transferred the money. "Thanks, Dad," she said. Then she added, "Hope everything goes okay." We hung up. She never came to the hospital. She didn't call the day of the operation either. As far as I know, once the money reached her account, my surgery disappeared from her mind completely. The morning of the operation, I woke at 4:50. I had lived alone in that house for years by then, but that morning the silence felt different. A big house occupied by one person has its own kind of quiet. Sometimes it's peaceful. Sometimes it's comfortable. That morning it felt heavy. I went downstairs and automatically started to make coffee before remembering I wasn't allowed to drink anything. So I sat on my usual chair near the front window with an empty stomach and watched the sky brighten behind the hills. October mornings in Eastern Tennessee can be beautiful. The light comes slowly through the trees, thin and pale at first. Then suddenly everything turns gold. I sat there watching it and had one thought I couldn't shake. If something went wrong today, the last real conversation I had with my youngest daughter was about the money she needed from me. I stayed in that chair for a while. Then I picked up my bag, ordered a ride, and went to the hospital alone. At admissions, I checked myself in. A nurse named Denise took my phone for safekeeping before they brought me into surgery. And then they wheeled me away. I ended up staying in the hospital for 12 days. Apparently, according to Dr. Harris, my recovery was going beautifully. I suppose beautifully has a different definition when you're the person standing beside the bed instead of the one lying in it. Recovery hurt. There isn't a poetic way to describe it. Pain has a way of becoming very personal at 3 in the morning. It wakes you up and introduces itself all over again, as if the two of you haven't already spent the entire day together. Then there are the smaller humiliations nobody puts in the cheerful hospital brochures. The walker, the bedpan, having to call someone because you can't safely do something you've been doing by yourself since childhood. But the hardest part wasn't physical. It was the chair. There was a visitor's chair beside my bed. Green vinyl, with one armrest scratched near the front. One leg must have been slightly shorter than the others because it rocked when anyone touched it. Not that anyone did. That chair stayed empty. Every day, Daniel called on the second day. He asked how I felt and told me to follow the doctor's instructions. He called again on day 6. That time, after asking about my pain level, he casually wondered whether I kept all my financial paperwork together. You know, Dad, just in case. It might be smart to get everything organized. I told him everything was already organized. I was an engineer for 38 years. Every insurance policy, deed, tax document, bank statement, and warranty I owned was labeled and filed in my study. Daniel laughed. Yeah, I should have known. Claire called almost every day during the first week. If you heard that without knowing anything else, you'd probably think she was devoted. The calls lasted 4 or 5 minutes. Most of that time was spent explaining why she hadn't managed to visit yet. There was traffic. One of the kids felt sick. Then the kid apparently wasn't sick. Mark's work schedule changed. A school event appeared. Then it turned out to be practice for the event. There was a deadline. Then another deadline. I have to give Claire credit for creativity. On day 8, she promised she would come on day 10. Day 10 arrived. Claire didn't. Instead, I received a text. Dad, I'm so sorry. Something happened. I'll explain later. Love you. I read it once. Then again. I put the phone on the little table beside my bed and looked at that empty green chair. Something changed in me. There wasn't any dramatic moment. I didn't cry. I didn't throw anything. I wasn't even angry in the way people imagine anger. It felt more like discovering a crack in a foundation. At first, it seemed small. Then you realize it has been there longer than you knew. Emily never called. On the 8th afternoon, Denise came in to check my blood pressure. She was probably in her late 50s, with the kind of practical kindness you sometimes find in nurses who've spent years watching people at their strongest and weakest. I was reading when she entered. She checked the monitor, wrote something down, then glanced toward the empty chair. Mr. Bennett, she said, do you have family nearby? I looked at her. Yes. I even smiled. She studied me for half a second. Then she nodded. It was the kind of nod that said she understood the answer I hadn't given. When she finished, she put her hand over mine. Just for a moment. If you need anything, you press that button. That was all. I thought about that moment more than I expected to. On the 12th day, Dr. Harris signed my discharge papers and announced that I was making excellent progress. A hospital volunteer pushed me downstairs in a wheelchair because apparently I wasn't allowed to walk out on my own power, even though everyone had spent 12 days encouraging me to walk. Hospital logic. At the entrance, I ordered a ride. My driver was a college kid named Mason. He put my bag in the trunk and asked if I'd enjoyed my stay. I looked at him. It was a hospital. He laughed so hard he apologized. I liked him immediately. The drive home took about 25 minutes. Mason didn't fill the silence with pointless conversation. I've always appreciated people who understand that silence doesn't automatically need fixing. When we reached Maple Ridge Road, he carried my bag to the porch. I thanked him. He wished me well and left. I stood outside my own house with my walker, my medication, and my discharge instructions. For some reason, I didn't go inside immediately. I looked at the front door. I'd installed that door myself in 1992. I'd replaced the handle once and refinished the wood twice. There was a small chip near the bottom I'd been planning to repair for years. Then I unlocked it. Everything was exactly the way I'd left it 12 days earlier. That sentence may not sound important. It was. The mail had piled up. The plant near the kitchen window was drooping. Nothing had moved. Nobody had stopped by. Nobody had come to check whether the pipes were okay or bring the mail or water the plant. Nobody had simply stood inside the place where their father lived. I slowly made my way into the kitchen. My knee hurt. My whole body felt tired. I filled the kettle and looked through the window toward the backyard. There was the old maple. There were the flower beds. There was the bench I'd built almost 20 years earlier. Everything was waiting exactly where I'd left it. And suddenly I saw that empty hospital chair again. I thought about Denise asking whether I had family. I thought about the smile I'd given her. I thought about Emily saying, "Hope everything goes okay," right after I sent her money. I made tea and carried it carefully to my chair. Then I sat there in the late afternoon light. For 12 days, I'd had nothing but time to think. Eventually, I finished my tea. I reached for my phone. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't call Claire. I didn't call Emily. I called Robert Hayes. Robert had been my attorney for 23 years. When he answered, I said, "Robert, I need to make some changes." One thing you learn as an engineer is that reacting and responding are two completely different things. A reaction is emotional. It's slamming a door. It's raising your voice. It's saying something cruel because for one brief moment, you want another person to feel the same pain they've caused you. A response is different. A response takes time. You examine the problem. You measure the pressure. You figure out exactly where the weakness is. Then, once you understand what you're dealing with, you decide what needs to change. That's how I'd approach problems for most of my adult life, and I wasn't about to abandon the habit now. Robert listened to me for almost 15 minutes without interrupting. That's one reason I kept him as my attorney for more than 2 decades. He was careful, patient, and almost painfully precise. Those are qualities I've always respected. When I finished explaining exactly what I wanted done, he remained silent for a few seconds. "Frank," he finally said, "are you sure about this?" I looked across my quiet kitchen. My walker was beside the table. The white pharmacy bag was still sitting on the counter. I could still picture that empty green chair in the hospital room. I've been sure since the 8th day I was in that hospital. Robert paused again. "All right," he said. "I'll prepare everything. Thank you." I hung up. That was it. No dramatic music. No shouting. No angry speech about ungrateful children. Just a decision. And eventually, paperwork. Outside my kitchen window, evening was settling over Knoxville. Somewhere nearby, the dog barked. A pickup truck rolled slowly down the street. Farther away, I could hear the faint sound of a train. Ordinary noises. The sounds of a world continuing as if nothing important had happened. 6 weeks later, I invited all 3 of my children to dinner. I want to be clear about my intentions that evening. I wasn't trying to trap them. I wasn't pretending to be weaker than I was. And I wasn't planning some dramatic confrontation. I simply wanted to watch. I've learned that if you give people enough room, eventually they'll tell you exactly who they are. The mistake most of us make is interrupting them before they finish. I cooked a pot roast and made cornbread using the recipe their mother had taught me years ago. Some recipes are more than food. They're memories you can eat. Daniel arrived first. Daniel always arrives early because he likes being considered dependable. He came through the door carrying an expensive bottle of red wine and gave me a hug that lasted slightly longer than his usual hugs. Then he looked around. His eyes traveled across the living room, the fireplace, the built-in shelves, the hardwood floors, then toward the dining room, then the kitchen. I knew that look. It was an assessment. "The house looks fantastic, Dad," he said. "It looks the same." "Well, sure. I just mean you've really kept it up." "I try." Claire arrived next, carrying a bakery pie in both hands. She hugged me tightly. Almost immediately, she started explaining why she hadn't visited me in the hospital. I listened. There had been sickness, work problems, the children's schedules, Mark's job, a problem with the water heater, possibly bad weather. By the time Claire finished, I felt as though my 12-day hospital stay had unfortunately happened during the complete collapse of modern civilization. I felt awful about it, she said. I understand. And I did. Maybe not in the way she hoped I understood. But I understood. Emily arrived 40 minutes late. She kissed me on the cheek, sat down at the table, and asked what we were eating. No mention of the hospital. No mention of the rent money. Before we'd made it halfway through dinner, she'd already checked her phone 3 times. I watched my children eat. Daniel kept glancing around the house. Claire laughed a little harder than necessary whenever I made a joke. Emily looked completely relaxed. Finally, I put down my fork. I've been thinking about something since the operation. 3 faces turned toward me. Interesting how quickly attention can sharpen. At my age, I continued, it's probably smart to make sure everything is organized. Robert and I have been going through my affairs. You know, making plans for whenever the time comes. Daniel leaned forward slightly. That's responsible, Dad. Claire nodded. Absolutely. That's really smart. Emily finally put down her phone. I looked at all 3 of them. Then I picked up the basket. Anybody want another piece of cornbread? What happened over the next several months was fascinating. Daniel began calling every Sunday morning at exactly 10. Not 10:05. Not 9:55. 10 o'clock. He asked about my knee, my sleep, my appetite, my blood pressure. For the first 15 minutes, Daniel became the most attentive son a man could possibly ask for. Then, eventually, the conversation would drift. Had I considered getting the house appraised? Was I still comfortable managing everything myself? Had I reviewed my investments recently? Was I keeping up with the property taxes? All reasonable questions, naturally, purely practical, just looking out for me. Claire started visiting on Thursdays. She brought groceries. Good groceries, too. Not a random bag of things she'd grabbed at a convenience store. She brought the coffee I actually drank, the bread I preferred, soup from the deli she knew I liked. Sometimes she'd stay for an hour or longer. We'd sit at the kitchen table and talk about her children, her garden, the neighborhood, or whatever else came to mind. And something unexpected happened during those visits. I felt grief, not because Claire was there, because she could have been there all along. This version of my daughter had always existed. This woman who remembered what kind of coffee I drank. This daughter who could sit across from me and ask how I was feeling and actually listen to the answer. She could have come on day 2, or day 5, or day 11. Any day, just one day out of 12. She could have sat in that green hospital chair for 20 minutes. But she hadn't. Now she was sitting in my kitchen every Thursday. And the difficult part was that I genuinely enjoyed having her there. That's what made everything complicated. Emily started texting too. How are you, Dad? Cold tonight. Stay inside. Once, she sent me a picture of a sunset without writing anything underneath it. I assumed that was her attempt at poetry. I answered every message with complete sentences and proper punctuation because I'm 76 years old and apparently incapable of replying with a single letter. My children were suddenly present. They called. They visited. They checked on me. They offered the attention I had once wanted them to give freely. Now, however, that attention seemed to come with an expectation attached to it. I accepted it anyway. I cooked for them. I laughed with them. I asked about their lives. And I never mentioned the hospital. Not once. I didn't make sarcastic comments. I didn't demand explanations. I didn't ask for apologies. I gave them nothing to argue against, nothing to defend, nothing they could negotiate their way out of. Because I wasn't interested in an argument. The hospital was over. I had survived it. But the lesson I'd learned there wasn't going anywhere. And while my children were busy becoming the devoted family I'd once hoped they would be, Robert already had the documents. 5 months after the operation, I was sitting on my front porch with a mug of coffee warm in my hands. It was one of those chilly March mornings Tennessee gets when winter and spring seem to be arguing over whose turn it is. The sky was clear, but the air still had a bite to it. My knee felt excellent. Better than excellent, actually. I had to give Dr. Harris credit. The man had done good work. By then, I was walking nearly 2 miles every morning. Ironically, I was probably in better physical condition than I'd been before the surgery. Physically, anyway. Some other things had turned out to be less healthy than I'd imagined. A robin landed near the porch steps and stood there staring at me for several seconds. Animals have a remarkable indifference toward human problems. The bird didn't care about my children. It didn't care about my hospital stay. It certainly didn't care about my will. I respected that. The previous month, I made a donation to the hospital. I specifically directed the money toward patient comfort, better chairs, warm blankets, and all those little things that don't sound important until you're the person spending days alone in a hospital room. I made the donation in Denise's name. I didn't tell her. I didn't tell my children either. Some things don't need an audience. There were now 3 charitable organizations listed in my will where my children's names had once been. The first supported military veterans throughout Tennessee, men and women who had spent years carrying burdens most people would never fully understand. The second was a scholarship fund for engineering students at the University of Tennessee. I liked the idea of helping some young person build a future. I'd spent my entire career believing that if you give somebody the right tools and teach them how to use them, they can create things that last far beyond themselves. The third organization supported a regional children's hospital. That choice was the easiest. Children don't choose to be sick. They don't choose hospital beds or surgeries or frightened parents sitting beside them. If some of my money could make that experience a little easier for even one family, I considered that money well spent. Then there was the house. For bedrooms, hardwood floors, the built-in shelves I'd installed with my own hands. The backyard, the old maple, the flower beds, the bench I'd built nearly 20 years earlier. After I was gone, the house would be sold. The money would be divided among those same organizations. Robert had all the instructions. He knew exactly what I wanted. There was one additional document in the file. A letter, one handwritten page. I wrote it in the same neat block lettering I'd used on plans, measurements, and field notes throughout my career. It was addressed to Daniel, Claire, and Emily. It read, "By the time you're reading this, I imagine you'll have questions. I want to answer the most important one. I spent 12 days in the hospital after knee replacement surgery. You knew the date 7 weeks beforehand. 49 days. I want that number to be clear. When I was discharged, I ordered my own ride home. When I opened my front door, the house was exactly as I'd left it. No one had been there. I'm not writing this because I stopped loving you. I never did. I'm writing it because every decision has a reason, and I spent my career believing reasons should be documented accurately. In engineering, we call that transparency. Families may have another word for it. I maintained this home carefully for many years. I hope what it is worth will now help people who need it. I love all 3 of you. That never changed. Dad, that Thursday, Claire arrived carrying a coffee cake. She was wearing a green coat I'd once told her looked nice. Dad, she called from the walkway, despite the fact that I was sitting in plain sight on the porch. She'd been doing that since she was a little girl. Even at 7 years old, she'd come running toward the house, shouting for me, while looking directly at me. I'd always found it endearing. I still did. Claire came up the steps and sat in the chair beside mine. We talked about her son's science fair. Then we complained about grocery prices. Then we debated whether the weather was finally warm enough to start planting tomatoes. She was good company. She always had been. When she showed up, I looked at her over the rim of my coffee mug. There were moments when I could see her mother in her. The way she smiled. The way she moved her hands when she was explaining something. There are things about your children that can pull you backward through 30 years without warning. For a moment, Claire wasn't a grown woman sitting beside me. She was 8 years old again, running through the backyard, calling for her father. I loved her. I still do. That's the part people sometimes misunderstand. You can love someone and still change your will. You can forgive somebody and still remember exactly what happened. You can sit on a porch drinking coffee with your daughter on a Thursday morning and genuinely enjoy every minute of it while refusing to rewrite 12 days of history, simply because the present has become more pleasant. Claire didn't know about the will. None of them did. Maybe she believed the Thursday groceries were repairing something between us. In a way, they were. They just weren't repairing what she thought. Those visits gave me time with my daughter. They gave me conversations I might otherwise never have had. They gave me back a version of Claire I thought I'd lost somewhere along the way. That had value. Real value. It simply wasn't financial value. Daniel continued calling every Sunday at 10. One Sunday, after asking about my sleep and whether my knee was still improving, he casually mentioned that a house a couple of streets away had recently sold. Apparently, it had gone for considerably more than anyone expected. Interesting market, he said. I'm sure. Have you ever thought about what this place might be worth now? No, really, not particularly. There was a short silence. Then Daniel cleared his throat. Anyway, I just want you to know we're here for you, Dad. Whatever you need. I looked through the window at the trees beginning to bud. I know, Daniel. And I did. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, Emily called. An actual phone call, not a text. That alone was unusual. She asked if I'd like to have lunch with her. Just the two of us. I almost asked why. Instead, I said yes. Then she said something I wasn't expecting. I've been thinking, Dad. About what? She hesitated. I don't think I really know you very well. I sat quietly. Is that a strange thing to say? She asked. No, I said. I thought about it for another moment. Actually, I think it's probably true. There was silence on the other end. Then Emily said, I'd like to change that. Something moved inside me. Not enough to erase the past. Nothing could do that, but enough to matter. I like that too. We met the following Saturday at a little diner on the other side of town. Emily ordered pancakes. I had eggs, toast, and coffee. We stayed there for almost 2 hours. For once, Emily and I didn't talk about money. We didn't discuss rent. There were no bills she needed help paying, no emergency she needed me to solve, and no problem waiting for her father to fix it. We simply talked. It was such an ordinary thing that I found almost remarkable. She told me about a man she'd been seeing for a few months. That was news to me. Then she admitted she had been thinking about changing careers. That was news too. I sat across from her, drinking my coffee, wondering how many important things had been happening in my daughter's life without either of us knowing much about the others. Then, to my surprise, she started asking about my work. Not the polite kind of questions people ask when they're only waiting for their turn to speak. Real questions. What did you actually do as an engineer? She asked. I smiled. You've had 33 years to ask me that. She laughed. I know. I'm asking now. So I told her. I told her about a highway overpass project that nearly went wrong in 1991. I told her about drainage systems and municipal buildings. I told her about the months I'd spent working on a water treatment project that nobody outside the engineering team would ever think twice about, even though thousands of people depended on it every single day. I even told her about a stress calculation I'd gotten wrong once. That mistake delayed an entire project for almost a month. I had to walk into a conference room full of people and explain exactly what had happened. Some of those men were considerably less forgiving about mistakes than I tried to be. Emily listened, really listened. She laughed in the right places. She asked follow-up questions. At one point, she leaned back in the booth and shook her head. I never knew any of this. I looked at her. You never asked. I didn't say it angrily. There was no accusation in my voice. It was simply accurate. She looked down at her plate. Her pancakes were getting cold. For several seconds, she didn't say anything. Then she looked up at me. Dad, I'm sorry. I waited. For not coming to the hospital. There it was. I've wanted to say that for months, she continued. I just didn't know how. I looked across the table at my daughter. My child, 33 years old, sitting in a diner with a plate of cold pancakes in front of her, finally saying the words I'd once thought I needed to hear. And I felt the full, complicated weight of being a parent. The love that doesn't disappear just because somebody disappoints you. The wound that doesn't require shouting to be real. The forgiveness that can exist without pretending nothing happened. I know, I said. I didn't tell her it was fine. Because it wasn't fine. I didn't say, don't worry about it. Because maybe she should worry about it a little. And I didn't tell her I'd changed my will. I simply said, I know. Then I picked up my coffee. And we kept talking. By early April, I was spending more time outside again. The flowers along the fence were beginning to return. That's something I've always admired about plants. They don't announce their comeback. They don't demand applause. They don't need anyone standing nearby to appreciate the effort. When the conditions are right, they simply return. I was 76 years old. I'd had my knee replaced. I'd gone to the hospital alone. I'd spent 12 days staring at an empty green chair. I'd come home with a driver I'd never met before that afternoon. And I'd changed my will. Since then, strangely enough, I'd eaten dinner with my children more times than I had during the previous year. They were good company. Mostly, they believed they would someday inherit my house. They wouldn't, but they could inherit something else while I was still alive. Sunday phone calls, Thursday coffee, Saturday lunches, cornbread, pot roast, stories they'd never bothered to ask me about before. They could inherit time. That's what I was still willing to give. The paperwork belonged to Robert. One morning, I was sitting outside drinking coffee when another bird landed on the porch railing. Maybe it was the same one I'd seen before. Probably not. I raised my mug anyway. Morning. It stared at me for a few seconds. Then it flew away. I went back to working in the garden. People sometimes think engineering is about the things everyone can see. The bridge, the building, the finished structure. But most of the important work happens before any of that. Calculations, measurements, stress tests, load estimates. Thousands of small decisions nobody notices if you've done them correctly. Then the structure stands for 50 years, and people drive across it every day without ever wondering why it didn't fall. I built my house carefully. I maintained it. I kept records. Every important document was labeled and stored in my study. When my time eventually comes, Robert will open a folder. He'll make a few calls. The house will be sold. The money will go exactly where I instructed. And my children will receive a letter. I imagine they'll be angry. Daniel will probably argue that I misunderstood their intentions. Claire may cry. Emily might remember the pancakes. I don't know. I won't be there. And strangely enough, that thought doesn't trouble me. Because this was never revenge. Not really. It was a decision. There's a difference. Revenge is about making someone hurt. A decision is about accepting what you've learned. For 12 days, there was an empty green chair beside my hospital bed. I looked at it every morning, every afternoon, every night. 3 children, 49 days of advance notice, 12 days in the hospital, 1 empty chair. Those are the numbers. Engineers trust numbers because numbers don't make excuses. But here's the part one didn't expect. My children came back into my life afterward. Maybe they came for the wrong reasons at first. Maybe some of them still have the wrong reasons. I can't know exactly what lives inside another person's heart. But Claire and I drink coffee together now. Daniel calls every Sunday. Emily knows what her father did for a living. And I know she's thinking about changing careers. Those things are real too. I don't need to pretend the hospital never happened in order to appreciate what came afterward. Both things can be true. I can love my children, and I can leave my estate to someone else. I can forgive, and I can allow consequences to remain. I can welcome them into my home today without promising them ownership of that home tomorrow. At my age, I've learned that love doesn't require you to lie to yourself. The flowers are blooming again. My knee works better than it has in years. My children call more often. My affairs are in order. For now, that's enough. Everything is exactly where I've decided it needs to be. But sometimes, late in the evening, I still think about that hospital room. I remember the machines beeping softly. I remember the fluorescent lights. I remember hearing visitors talking and laughing in the hallway. Most of all, I remember that empty chair. And I find myself wondering something. If my children had known that chair would eventually cost them their inheritance, all 3 of them probably would have fought over who got to sit in it. But if money is the reason someone finally shows up, does their presence mean the same thing? I don't know. Maybe that's a question every parent has to answer for themselves. So let me ask you, if you were in my position, if your children left you alone for 12 days when you needed them most, then suddenly became attentive after hearing you were organizing your estate, would you change your will too? Or would you give them one more chance?